Hello and good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone to our webinar presentation today titled Weight and Appearance Bias, Recommendations for Self-Reflection and Personal Growth, presented by Dr. Peter Jaberg. Dr. Jaberg earned his bachelor's degrees from Millikan University and his master's and Ph.D. from Southern Illinois University at Carbondale. Dr. Jaberg is currently a faculty member at Forest and teaches in our PsyD program. I'd like to encourage everyone to submit questions throughout the presentation using the dialog box on the left side of the screen. And there will be information on how to apply for our programs and how to schedule a visit with us following the presentation. So with that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Peter Jaberg.
Thank you very much, Brett. So I am thrilled and excited to spend what I imagine for most people is a lunch hour. Let's make this lunch hour as exciting and meaningful as we can make it. The topic for today includes the idea of weight bias. Overall, we could start with the question of why should I care about weight bias? What is weight bias? What does this mean for me? Those are all very important questions. I'm not going to assume that you just automatically think it's something that should be important to you, although you did sign up for this webinar. So I hope you have some interest and some background, but I'll share those details. We'll spend a few minutes discussing what are some common assumptions, attitudes, and beliefs. What of those are obvious? What are not so obvious? What does that mean for you as a person, as an aspiring provider, whether that be a psychologist or a counselor or applied behavior analyst? And then finally, what are some further resources and tools for self-exploration and personal development? So that is a brief overview for today. Really, I decided to focus this presentation on self-reflection and personal growth because, I could email you and send 10 links for good books to read if you wanted to learn about weight bias, or if you wanted to learn about the effectiveness of dieting or the negative impact of weight on health. There's all sorts of references out there. But what I'm hoping to do is to ask some questions today to get you thinking about your automatic thoughts, your automatic assumptions, sort of the life you walking around on the streets from day to day. So if I want people to engage in self-reflection and personal growth, including myself, what sort of activities and interactions, are likely to be helpful? If we think about the ism, well, whether it be weightism, racism, sexism, genderism, we have some literature that tells us what sort of interactions are likely to be helpful and what sort of interactions might actually trip us up, or that might actually go in the opposite direction of what we were trying to accomplish. And so what's interesting from the field of social psychology is that if I'm part of a group, and this is a group, it's a group including at least, it looks like 4 or 5 different people right now, online listening and potentially interacting, but also a group of individuals perhaps watching this webinar at a later date. I have to be careful to think of who I am and who is the us, who is the we, who is the me, and who is the I. I have to think very carefully about those assumptions. Who am I defining as myself and who's different than me? I'm going to make different assumptions for me or people I associate with me and someone that I think is of another group, another gender, another race. Dovidio and Geartner, if you look at the first bullet point on this slide, studied something called aversive racism. And I think it's reasonable to think something like this could occur with bias related to weight, and I'll get to that in a minute. But they were interested in something called aversive racism, and what they found is that for people who prided themselves on being open to discussing race, people who prided themselves in being open to exploring different racial realities, that paradoxically, even though they were open to all those things, they tended to avoid contact with members of the other. They tended to avoid contact with people they defined as the other, as someone different from them. And, honestly, that left a lot of scholars scratching their head. Why in the world would that be the case? When we studied these individuals, they really did appear to mean it. They appeared to be open to discussing race, open to discussing their own biases, but when it came down to actual behaviors, they nonetheless showed the same pattern of avoiding intergroup contact. Part of what was figured out is that if I'm invested in being open and appearing non-biased, it's uncomfortable for me to think about how I'm biased. So if I were to ask, I do have other individuals in the room with me and some people online. Don't actually reply to this. This is one of those things to reflect on. But the thing to think about is the more that I say that I am against bias, against racial bias, against sexism, the more difficult it might be for me to actually consider, am I racist? Am I sexist? Well, I took the course. I've talked to some minority group members. I've been through some cathartic events. Therefore, I'm no longer racist, and I don't have to confront my biases. I might talk a good talk, and I might mean it when I talk it, but there are some subtle behaviors that I might admit that might be inconsistent with. So for that reason alone, I'm not going to ask any of you to self-divulge, do you have bias against people based on weight? Okay? What works better is private conversations, smaller group conversations in a safe environment. And while I hope this environment is safe, heck, you're in your own office, you're in your own room, it's a brief conversation, and this isn't a recurring class where we can come back and process things and do safety checks with each other to make sure that if injury occurs, we aren't injured too much. So if it helps you for today, focus on the other. That's okay. You don't have to focus on me yet. Hopefully this presentation is a seed that is planted that you can come back and visit and reflect on for yourself, reflect on with a partner, a spouse, a sibling, someone else, and have a meaningful conversation. This isn't supposed to be Alcoholics Anonymous where you have to, hi, my name is Peter, and I'm a weighted. That's not the goal for this presentation. I will ask a number of questions today along the themes of, if you're aware of Bill Cosby's picture pages, well, I'll ask a question and leave a period of silence. During that time, if you're alone, you can yell at your monitor screen if you want. I think that'd be quite amusing. If you want to, you can take notes because I understand some of these things might take a while to process. You might not just come up with an answer in 10 or 15 seconds. There are some times where I might actually want a response, and I'll try to be clear in those situations. Okay? And finally, we need to consider, if we're going to start reflecting on our potential biases, what those implicit and explicit assumptions are. Implicit means that it might not always be obvious to us. It might not be something that's intentional or something we're aware of, but that happens nonetheless. And then the explicit is more of something that anyone could observe walking by. They'd see and they'd know that the behavior occurred. In that class is something called microaggressions. And if you're not familiar with microaggressions, most of the either graduate students or aspiring graduate students that might be listening, that's a term you should know, or that if you don't, go out and check it out. But it's the idea that sometimes we do things that harm other people, whether it's intentional or not. Whether that was our conscious goal or not, we might still do things that lead to injustice. And oftentimes those quote-unquote microaggressions, and that comes from Sue and Sue and that group of researchers, is the idea of automatic thoughts, that as we live life, we develop stereotypes, we develop biases, and guess what? That's okay. If we didn't develop stereotypes, if we didn't discriminate between stimuli, we'd be much different beings and organisms. Right? We need to be able to discriminate between what mushrooms are safe to eat and what mushrooms aren't safe to eat. We need to judge where we think there's a tiger crouched behind a tree and where there's not a tiger crouched behind a tree. We would not be a very successful species if we didn't have the ability to discriminate or have bias about objects, things, organisms in our environment. I dare say we might not exist, or not in our current form. So step one is just to acknowledge that we all have biases and we discriminate on a daily basis. Now, is discrimination that marginalizes a group or that results in social injustice for a group a problem? Yes, we widely accept that as a society. The field of psychology accepts that. APA has some very strict guidelines and encouragements for what I, as a psychologist, should be in my professional life. Certainly that type of bias and discrimination is that, but overall the process of bias and discrimination is adaptive for human beings. And so if we can understand it that way, maybe that's the first step in thinking about what are my biases. Not am I biased or not. Oh, I swear I'm not biased. I'm nice to all fat and skinny people I ever meet. I never say a negative thing towards them. Yeah, okay, maybe. But if I hold that belief, I might be less open to exploring what are my thoughts, what are my assumptions. So throughout the rest of the, let's say, 45 to 50 minutes we have left, the questions I really want you to reflect on that help us get at more of those less obvious forms of bias have to do with how what we say doesn't line up with what we mean. And I'm not asking for judgment. I'm not asking you to judge me. I'm really not asking you to judge me. I'm not asking you to judge me, and I'm not asking you to judge yourself, but really look for, even in my presentation, areas where what I say doesn't line up with what I mean, or what they say doesn't line up with what they mean. And again, if it's easier for you to think about today in terms of them or they, that's okay. You can start. Of course, I'd ask you to think about who is they, but that's not going to be answered quickly either. So I keep wanting to scroll down. Here we go. Okay. So weight bias, sometimes it's called weight stigma. When we apply that bias to ourselves or our attitudes, we might call that weight stigma. When we treat other people differently based on weight status, that could be called weight discrimination. They don't all mean exactly the same thing, but they're related. They're in the same family. They have picnics together. Okay? They are very much related. Weight bias or stigma, as you can read on your screen, is discrimination or bias based on perceptions of weight or perceived weight status. Are we really talking about weight, or are we talking about size and shape? Take a few minutes to just reflect on that. In the literature, it's often referred to as weight bias or weight stigma. I was facetiously talking to some of my colleagues the other day. I could probably hide a packet of lead pellets somewhere on my body that you couldn't visually see. Would they be able to just detect my change in weight? If I weighed 15 pounds more? Is there some intuitive human sense to tell them that, wait a minute, Peter weighs, I think he weighs 15 more pounds now. I also made the comment I could bring in a packet of mercury, but then one person said, I don't want to be next to you if you're carrying that much mercury. So think about that. What is it that we mean by weight bias? Is it really about weight, or is it more about size and shape? And maybe some of those more automatic judgments that we make about people based on our perception of their size and shape. In struggling with this question of what do we call this bias? What do I call this bias? I'm reminded of some early interactions I had with one of our alum, Dr. Jennifer Lenkus, now Copeland, who really got me interested in this topic. And just thinking about what do we call this phenomenon of bias? Is it really appearance bias? And one of the issues that we had with using the term appearance bias is then you get into questions of, well, are we now talking about use of cosmetics, use of prosthetics, height, what, physical attractiveness, What do we mean? Now, on a very simple level, all of those things, I think, interact with perceptions of weight or weight status. So those are things you want to think about throughout the remainder of the presentation. The power of the word, the F word. Do I want to say the other? I'm not going to say the other F. Fat. The word fat. It's a controversial word. It's often a word associated with weight bias, with stigmatizing interactions with people. For explicit weight bias, the comments about someone being can cause a lot of harm in some contexts, can cause a lot of pain, can be part of bullying. Okay, we have evidence for that. There's something called the fat acceptance movement that's trying to reclaim the word fat, and part of that is using the word and using it with comfort and confidence and with assertiveness. Well, I wish life were so simple. Is that the best thing to do? Is it not? I'm going to ask a question later in the presentation about how you feel about what you think about when you hear the fat. Maybe not being used with you, but maybe being used with other people. What are some of your thoughts? Through the presentation today, I might go back and forth between using terms obese, overweight, fat, people with fat. I don't have it in my slides, but people with adipose tissue. Okay, that's a misnomer too. We all have adipose tissue. If we didn't, we'd be in very serious trouble. So what is it that we really mean when we really say when we use these terms? It's recognized that fat can be a word that can still be painful for a lot of people, so that caution should be used with the F word. A little tongue-in-cheek, if you want to think, that's our word, it's not your word, that sort of thing. There's certainly some debate about that. Obese and overweight, as defined by the CDC, are very specific terms that may or may not be useful. Those seem in many ways to be more politically correct terms. If you agree with that, another reflection question for you might be, why or how are those words better? Why is that better than the word fat? How? Okay? But again, you don't have to answer that right now. I certainly don't want you to answer to this. I want you to reflect on that. Do skinny people have problems too? I mentioned Dr. Jenny Copeland. She has a blog or a webpage of sorts. One of them is referred to as the Skinny on Skinny. I would be jumping to conclusions if I were to say this is a presentation about obese individuals. It very much is not. We do, in fact, treat people differently, especially in the United States, based on appearance status, size status, assumptions about weight and appearance. Okay. Recently, there was a media presentation on the search for the healthy fat person. And what I mean by that, I was watching a morning news show, and the anchor had a metabolic specialist on the show who's also a medical consultant. They have expertise in all those areas. And basically asked, is it possible to be fat and also be healthy at the same time? And it was posed as this all or nothing argument. Okay, as this all or nothing argument. Is it possible to be fat and healthy? That it was really important that we figure out, is there this mythical person who's this healthy fat? And it seems so important. Now, I have to be fair, in the media, you're not paid to give ambivalent stories. You're supposed to take a position that is potentially controversial. So I don't blame media for the fact that this particular story was framed in terms of, can fat people be healthy or not? Really, what's important is, are you living a life that's in a way that's meaningful for you? What is your health, and how does that fit in with your goals for life and how you function on a day-to-day basis? Because you know what? There are people who are heavier than what? I don't know. Heavier than other people who are relatively healthy. And you know what? There's plenty of skinny, slender people who, I don't wish this upon anybody, but who could have an event tomorrow, and that would be that. We often tie in health and appearance so much. You can't really talk about weight bias, it seems, without talking about health. Okay, so Those are some things to contemplate as we go forth in this presentation. Poole and Peterson have a wonderful, and Rebecca Poole, have a nice chapter in a recent book about health stigma and healthcare. And, you know, us being a professional school of psychology, and in essence creating healthcare providers of sorts, I thought it'd be really important to focus particularly on the impact of weight bias and how that actually affects people. So, there is evidence that suggests fat people tend to avoid routine medical care because emphasis on weight as a recurring provider theme. So let me be clear. For the most part, most Americans are not good about going to the doctor. Okay? Normalization. Most Americans don't follow up for routine medical care. A good number of Americans use acute care when conditions are progressed. They go to the emergency room. We can talk about access to health care. My goodness, a whole nother webinar. You'll have to sign me up some other time, Brett, right? Or we can get Dr. Luding to talk about that. Individuals with adipose, excessive, a lot of adipose tissue, avoid that routine medical care more often than individuals who aren't classified as obese or overweight. They avoid those appointments at a higher rate. Oftentimes, reasons cited for that have to do with the weighing ritual. It's pretty common for most primary care providers. The very first thing you do is sometimes strip to your skivvy, sometimes not. Get weighed by the nurse and then go sit on a table and wait for a half hour or sometimes longer for the doctor to come in. That can be an aversive experience for all those involved, but even potentially for individuals who are obese. Oftentimes there's insufficient or inadequate instruments, environment, supplies. Commonly cited issues even have to do with what's in the waiting room, chairs in the waiting room, how's the waiting room organized, how friendly is it for individuals of different sizes. Those are all common complaints. The size and the appropriateness of examination tables are all stimuli within the environment that lead to fatter individuals to avoid those medical appointments. And oftentimes, not only is weight reduction often a single-minded focus of the provider, okay, but oftentimes the amount of time spent with larger clients is less, with larger patients is less, and the range of interventions tend to be narrow and tend to be mostly focused on weight reduction. Now, I'm not attacking the medical field. To be fair, in a couple slides, I'm going to share some additional weight bias that occurs in health settings that studied social workers, nurses, psychologists, counselors, a variety of what I call healthcare professionals. While there's some subtle differences between disciplines, weight bias is pervasive across those disciplines, and it can affect our clients in ways that aren't in their to their best benefit. We know that preventive care, that regular maintenance healthcare is important for everybody. So anytime we have a group that we can identify as not seeking out that healthcare, that represents bona fide risk. In terms of healthcare providers, however, I wanted to share real quick that there is hope. Kushner et al. Did a study with first-year medical students at the Feinberg School of Medicine at Northwestern University. They were using what are called standardized patients. To me, it makes more sense to think about simulated patients. They were genuine patients, but they were patients who had been trained and prepped so that it was a focused training opportunity for the students. For those of you that are in graduate training for psychology, think about a training clinic where you might have clients who are real clients, but they're well aware that it's a training clinic. So it's a little bit different that way. And what Kushner et al. Found was that even just an hour or so of specific information about weight bias and the impact of that weight bias on their patient care And then 15 minutes of coaching after that dramatically altered their interaction with the simulated patient. Okay, so the good news is, the hope is that while we can identify these pervasive themes of weight bias in the health field, there's hope that intervention could be effective and that it might not have to be overly complicated or convoluted training, that just some small raise in awareness, some small raise in self-reflection, some small increase in effort can go a long way to improving the quality of interactions between patients and their providers. I keep trying to scroll. I got to remember to click. So, more broadly, beyond just medicine, where and how does weight bias occur? Rowling really pioneered the field of weight discrimination within the workforce, did a number of studies in the 90s. For a more recent study, see Grant and Mitzi. What they found, very broadly speaking, is that discrimination is pervasive when individuals identified as obese have been interviewed. As many as 60 to 70% stated, self-reported, that they believed that they had been discriminated against based on their weight in an employment setting, related to decisions about hiring, related to decisions about salary, as well as promotion. What Grant and Mitzi found was that how much weight discrimination occurred really depended on what the perceived value of appearance was to the job. So is the person in a highly visible job? Are they in sales where appearance is going to matter? And if that was the case, then discrimination seemed to be greater. Or is there something in their role, a physical requirement? Whether a bona fide occupational difference or not, the perception that a physical role and assumptions based on functioning based on being fat, then there was more discrimination in those type of situations. There's a gender issue here, and it's true for a number of different areas for weight bias, that while weight bias occurs for both men and women, unfortunately women are double marginalized. The weight bias that occurs for women is more so than it occurs for men who might have similar weight, similar size, similar appearance. In fact, within the workforce, women make about 4 to 6% less if they're perceived as being obese, whereas men make anywhere from 0.5% to 1% less if they're perceived as obese. So again, it applies to both men and women, but there's a form of double marginalization with women who are fat in the workplace. For family, there's a famous car study. If you haven't heard of the car study, it was really popular in the media a few years ago. It was really an extension of a study conducted by Crandall, where the authors were looking to see, is there a difference in how families support individuals who might be obese or overweight, and found that those who were quote-unquote heavier had to pay more of their college funding through external funding, through grants, through working, through foundations, whereas those that weren't as heavy relied a little bit more on things like family money, support from a partner. And so does it make a difference in who gets cars? What they found was the group of students that had to get financing or who had to pay for their own cars out of pocket were heavier by a couple BMI points and were technically in what would be considered the obese or the overweight to obese range, and those who had their family buy their cars were just on the other side of that split line, and were in the normal weight. And so this study was lauded as, hey, wait a minute, even families are biased towards their skinnier children, and they buy them cars. See? And I'm not saying that that was the author's intent. That's how the media picked it up. To be fair to Creha and Bolt, it's interesting because they framed it that students who financed their own cars were heavier than those who used family aid. And it was a medium effect size. It wasn't huge, but there was an effect size. How do we interpret these findings? Well, the authors tried to control for a variety of likely compounds, a lot of other explanations for why we might see this pattern. And the implication was, well, this is one more sign of weight bias. And this is an example of where we might look at how is what we're saying different than what we mean, and what are some other realities. So one interpretation is that heavier adult children, weren't treated favorably by parents. What might, and this is an actual question out there to the audience, what might be another reasonable interpretation of that finding? I'll give you a little while. Well, one possible other answer might be that the heavier students were more independent. I mean, in a society that supposedly values individualism, I would argue it's probably more mature for a college student to figure out how to pay for their own car. But that's not what I assumed, and that's not what a lot of people assumed who read this car study. The assumption was rather quickly that it must be because of preferential treatment for the children, not necessarily a perfectly plausible hypothesis that, quote unquote, the heavier students may have been more independent. And isn't that something we value as a society? Why or how did that get twisted into evidence for weight bias? Something to think about. Let's move on. Some of the most common beliefs, attributions, and myths widely held regarding individual fat. Remember, I'm going to be using different terms today. Just if any particular term strikes you, remember to just make a note of that, and you can think about that at some later point. But I think it's important. I know I'm lumping together beliefs, attributions, and myths. Sometimes beliefs are based on facts. Sometimes beliefs are based on kernels of fact. And sometimes beliefs are really reflective more of myths, that there's not a whole lot of truth, but it's widely accepted that it's true. And so in terms of our emotions on how we think about ourselves and how we think on others. So Davis Quayle and et al., and Davis Quayle, and it's another Davis Quayle and a third author, as well as Schwartz et al. 2003, specifically studied these beliefs, attributions, and myths with either health providers or psychologists. And I chose that on purpose. In the Poole and Hewer reference, they discuss those biases for psychologists and health providers, but also a lot of biases in a lot of other areas like employment, like interpersonal functioning, okay? So I wanted to provide you with those resources. So those bullet points on this slide are really my summary of reading from a variety of references. Most of the common beliefs, attributions, and myths. So this is they. This is people. I'm not saying that you individually hold. This is that general, okay, that individuals with fat often lazy, unmotivated, or apathetic. That individuals with fat are not quite as bright or are stupid. Okay, that people who are obese lack in self-discipline, self-control, or incapable of making meaningful changes in life. The myth of controllability. Gee, if you were fat, why wouldn't you do something about it? Why haven't you done something about it? Geez, what's wrong with you? Now, I'll admit, saying these things out loud, I'm uncomfortable. Because when I reflect on myself, I like to think I don't think that way, or I would never make those attributions about other people. But remember that if I just say that, insist upon that, am I really open to exploration? And if this is important to me, I ought to have the courage to say those things out loud. Okay? My goal is not to hurt anyone participating today. But I want you to think about this. If hearing those things wasn't uncomfortable for you, think about someone saying that about a partner, a spouse, a family member. And just think about how that feels. It might be uncomfortable for a minute, but just sit with it for a second. This is why weight bias is important. That emotional connection I'm having with you guys right now, that's why this conversation is important. Would you want someone saying that about your brother or sister or mother or father or partner? So a little more tongue-in-cheek to lighten the mood. You've sat with it for a few seconds. Houston, we have a space travel. I have good news. If you go to the doctor and they tell you you need to lose 10% of your body weight, I have some ideas. Okay? Number one, human arms represent about 10% of the average body weight for human beings. So if you had your arms surgically removed, you could lose that 10% like that. I'm sure your doctors would be thrilled about that. No, of course not. That's ridiculous. Here's the other good news. If you travel to the SVU planets, Saturn, Venus, Uranus, your weight, because remember, weight's the interaction of mass and gravity, would actually be about 10 to 20% less. So you could find a way. Call Richard Branson. I don't know. We haven't really mastered, light speed yet, and it would take beyond a lifetime to get to any of those planets, really. But if you wanted to go to Saturn, Venus, or Uranus, you could go there and you could meet that doctor's order really quick, and you would in fact. Again, are we really talking about weight? I mean, space travel would be fun. Don't get me wrong, but are we really talking about? And does it really have to do with self-discipline and control? Okay. In society, in the United States, there's the, I'm going to say it wrong, and then I'm going to have the First Lady, Michelle Obama, mad at me, but the Keep Moving campaign, where there's this assumption that people are obese or overweight because they don't move enough. Is there a kernel of truth there? Yeah. Am I a metabolic expert? No. Am I a dietitian? No. Am I an expert in exercise? No. None of those things. I've read enough to know there probably is a kernel of truth for probably people. So then next the question becomes, well, if there's a kernel of truth, why not just beat people over the head with it, right? It's a serious issue. We can document the quote-unquote drain on society that occurs from people who are obese. There's plenty of studies out there communicating that truth. So what's the harm in that? Okay, so maybe it's not as controllable as we think. There's a phenomenon where 99.8% of people think they're experts and what only 0.02% actually know about. I mean, how many people have actually completed advanced training in dietetics, metabolism, physiology? It's a lot of people, but out of 350 million Americans, it's a tiny, tiny percent. But we all, for some reason, when it comes to obesity, overweight, diet, and exercise, we all that we're experts and have opinions. So I'm not going to claim to know about all those. I can say that there is a kernel of truth. I'm not here today to tell you that being overweight or being of an obese status is not unhealthy. There are health detriments, but those health detriments tend to get magnified and exaggerated in mainstream medical literature, as one example. So, we're back to a few questions. What comes to mind when you hear other people use the word fat? When and with whom do you hear the F word? And I'm not asking for responses this time. This is a question for you to write down and come back to if you can't answer it right now. We are in America currently in a war on obesity. What does it mean to be in a war? Who are the enemies? Think about war a little bit and how we tend to villainize the other. What does this mean for us as a society proclaiming war on obesity? Finally, I'd like you to think about rationalizations for weight bias. And without naming any names, because I don't want to shame anybody, I've often heard comments like, and again, playing on the myth of controllability, individuals who are fat, individuals who are obese, who are classified as overweight, well, they should be ashamed of themselves. Maybe that can be a motivating factor for people to lose weight. In other words, if I feel bad enough about myself, I'll actually do something about it. And it's hard for me to say that. I had a little catch in my voice. If I'm ashamed enough of myself, then maybe I'll actually, if I'm ashamed enough about how I look, maybe I'll go work out. If I'm ashamed enough about how my hair looks, I'll go get it cut, shampoo it, condition it. Or if I'm ashamed of myself, I'll go out and I'll get treatment for my acne so I can be one of the beautiful people. It's not that simple, trust me. It's a good thing we don't have the camera trained on these. So, shame and guilt is often cited as a motivating factor for people to live. And so I think it's a fair question to ask, does shame or lead to effective change of any kind? Is shame or a guilt effective? Just out of curiosity, because I'm stuck in the EBSCO-hosts and PsycInfos and TRIP databases, I just searched popular literature with terms effective in shame or effective in guilt. And what I found was a quick hit piece on the UN where they basically showed for those United Nations interventions where shame or guilt was the primary component of UN sanctions, the rate of actual change occurring as a result of that change was essentially zero. So, I like the UN. They probably have some wisdom there. So that's what I found from the popular culture. When I went and searched EBSCO for terms like effectiveness, change, and shame, I also searched instead of shame for guilt. I got 98 hits. This was not meant to be a thorough literature review or a comprehensive scholarly examination, more of just a little survey of what's out there. I got 98 results, only 55 after those redundant references were taken out. So of those, 5 of those sources included, of those results included the search terms, so effectiveness, shame, and change, but really had nothing to do with what I was interested in. There was maybe a John F. Kennedy speech that used those 3 words, but really wasn't related to what I was looking at. 3 out of 55 represented scholarly evidence for effectiveness of the use of shame in the change process. All 3 of those were in the areas of justice and criminal remediation. Now think about that. That kind of makes sense. Do we want criminals to feel shame? Yeah, they've done something wrong. They have violated some essence of human morality. I'm not saying the justice system's perfect, but presuming that they've been convicted and they've actually done something, they should feel shame. Okay, at least in the United States, that's a belief of our justice system. So okay, I don't have a problem with that. Just as an aside, of those 3, there's really only one where shame was found an effective intervention. It was with adolescents in Australia in a program called the RISE program. And guess what? The use of shame raised the report of empathy and the report of sorrow for conducting the crime, but actually didn't alter the chances of actually committing that behavior again. So to say it worked is even a misnomer. It worked for what purpose? For the purpose of maybe raising some empathy or apparent empathy, but it didn't appear to affect recidivism at all. Kind of interesting. In another study referenced, I actually should have moved it to the other category, but another one of those 3, what they found is that with not adolescents, but with adults, with young women who'd been convicted of crimes that were often interpersonal crimes, their functioning in society was better after shame was reduced. Okay? Of the remaining 47, whether it was for depression, PTSD, health conditions, whatever behavior it was that was meant to be changed, 47 of those sources, every single time, the goal was to reduce, not build shame. Why do we treat obesity, overweight, fatness like we convicted criminals? Why do we treat those individuals differently? And by we, I mean, you can decide whether you include yourself. I'll include, okay? I can speak for myself, okay? So the overwhelming empirical evidence that we have says, yes, shame is important for change, but not in making the shame worse, but actually reducing the shame. Okay? And if you're not sure why or how that happens, this is a little teaser. I'm not going to just give you the answer today. It's out there. You can find it. You're welcome to email me if you want, if you think you know how it works. If I have any students or alum out there participating, you should already know that. But think about that. Why do we think shame works? In terms of groups, remember I started out with talking about race and racism and how in groups, if we directly challenge people on their bias, if we can actually make their biases stronger. Okay? If I'm in a group of people and they're 10 Jets and 10 Sharks, for those of you who know that West Side Story, and I as a say, hey, you Sharks, you're wrong, you're biased, X, Y, and Z. We know through social psychology that most likely I'm going to strengthen their position against, not necessarily win them over to my side. Cole, in looking at groups, saw if a problem is identified. And I'm not saying that obesity is a problem per se, but let's just for a minute that the concession that it is a problem. In an unhealthy group, what happens is we blame individuals, we point fingers, and therefore we no longer have to deal with the issue as a group because we've isolated individuals that we can blame. Because as long as we can continue to blame those individuals, we don't have any shared responsibility to change things. But a group where everyone takes some responsibility, everyone has a part or a role in finding a solution, and where everyone's views are valid. Notice I didn't say everyone's views are agreed. Notice I didn't say everyone's views are unconditionally accepted, but rather everyone's views are valued. You can have a healthy group process address that problem. So there's some important things about ownership. We want to think at the social level. If we as U.S. citizens are joining, it's not just President Obama and his wife. It's a lot of mainstream institutions.
Okay. Well, we just had some technical issues. I'm not sure where I left off in terms of those who might be listening, but I was just saying how Cole in his research found that if we were to concede that weight, in fact, is a problem or issue for our group, in this case the United States, really the best hopes for meaningful change would be shared responsibility, valuing everyone's contributions and having a belief that we can all be part of the solution. Next, I wanted to share some resources with you. The first set of resources, okay, here, let me get the mouse. Like that? Or did I mess it up? Oh, okay. Our first set of resources involve some references. Oh, excuse me. You'll notice here that Pohl and Hewer, and Pohl's one of the main contributors to the Yale Rudd Center. You can check that out on a web page on the next slide. But they wrote a very nice review and update of stigma and obesity across areas, not just with healthcare or in health settings or with providers, but across different domains of society. So that would be a good article to start out with if you wanted a good summary of stigma and obesity. The next reference is Harriger and Thompson. And this is more of an article for people who work with children, for pediatrics. And again, it's more of a summary and overview of weight bias and body image as it might be important for the pediatric practitioners. And then finally, there's a reference related to social work. As I was just saying, it doesn't need you don't need to be a social worker to benefit from reading through Elizabeth Waller's piece. She's a great scholar, a great mentor for many different fields. And there's some recommendations in there for self-reflection and asking yourself questions along the lines of what I've used today, but maybe more pointed specifically about some sources of biases. References to start with. These are more scholarly references than pop culture references, though, I'll warn you. On the next slide, I have information about the Rudd Center. The Rudd Center is affiliated with Yale and Rebecca Poole. There are all sorts of references on that page. I'm not going to open it right now, but if you go there, you can see all sorts of useful resources. What's really important, there's useful information about health, weight, appearance, but more importantly, there are measures to measure your explicit weight bias. And I really haven't been talking about explicit bias too much today because explicit bias seems like it should be obvious. And you're the best expert on you. You've been living your life, your entire life, hopefully, and you should be aware of what your explicit beliefs are. That being said, what I found the first few times that I took some of these explicit measures, I knew myself pretty well, but I didn't fully appreciate all the different areas of weight bias. And so by going through and completing those explicit measures, the hope is that maybe you'll learn something about weight bias in that process. And it couldn't hurt. They're pretty quick. If you're interested in exploring your implicit assumptions, Teachman, Brownell, a variety of authors have found sort of sneaky ways to try and get around the corner, because we can't always be aware of what we implicitly or automatically think. Sometimes that's like trying to see the air we breathe, and that can be a little bit trickier. So also on that webpage, there's some links to some instruments that you could use to evaluate, test, or research those implicit associations. Quite frankly, growth is a developmental process, and we all might be at different places. We might be ready for different challenges, different exercises at different times. And that's part of the field we're still researching and trying to figure out. When and how might intervention, education, change strategies be most effective, and for whom? For what stages of learning, what stages of development? So, you might not be at a place, even after today, where you might be ready to ask yourself deep questions about self. That might be too much. You might not be ready for that. But again, if it helps you to think about the other first, maybe there's something that can be learned about yourself by thinking about the other, which tends to be a lot easier to think about. Frank conversations. Now, that seems pat, right? Well, of course, frank conversations about everything. Frank conversations about the economy. Frank conversations about taxes. That seems to be the answer about to everything. But thinking back on what I shared about groups and about group dynamics and who we think about as in-group and who we think about as the other, really influences the quality of those frank conversations. Some key aspects include mutual trust in the growth process. So it's not necessarily if I have Mr. Side that we're going to have a conversation. It's less important that we agree on every fact we're about to discuss. What's more important is that we both have faith in each other, that we can engage in a healthy conversation, that if we value that healthy conversation above our individual opinions, that's what makes it a safe environment to then talk about how we might disagree with each other. He's wearing red today. I'm wearing purple. So you can assume whatever you want. It also helps to build that trust to remind each other of those shared core values. So in other words, if Brett and I are talking and it gets heated and we both feel like giving up, of just saying to heck with it, we might give each other the one-finger salute and walk and change. We're both invested in self-development. If we can remind each other of those in those moments of heat, it's not that we have to do away with that intense emotion, but rather that's a healthy way for processing that intense emotion. So in other words, we can have intense emotions about each other, maybe even against each other, but still have some meaningful emotional connection or affiliation. That's when we're less likely to be defensive. That's when we're less likely to say, well, you're just nuts. I don't agree with that. And then finally, smaller groups might be best. That's just the truth of the matter. Smaller groups might be very much the best way to do that, at least in our society here in the United States. I'm not as familiar with the size of groups in optimal performance in other cultures, but those are some key guidelines there that might be really meaningful. Another thing that you could do just in your day-to-day activities, reflect on how you see and treat others, and then contrast that with how you think about and treat yourself. Now, this is probably the most psychologically challenging recommendation I've had, because this is the first one where I'm really saying, you as a person, how do you feel? Thinking about you, okay? But it doesn't have to be about weight. It can be about anything. How do I treat others when I'm out in public? How do I treat myself when I'm out in public? You can start with any variety of topics, but that's a good general recommendation just for self-reflection on the whole. And if you get comfortable with that, then maybe if you're not quite at the place to think about weight bias, you can come back to weight bias at a later point. Are there differences in how I treat others and how I treat myself, and what does that mean? It might be you treat other people better than yourself. And that can be a pretty intense realization. You don't have to have it right now. No, stop. Don't do it right now, Brett. I know you're thinking about it, but eventually you might come back to that reality. Finally, I wanted to share a group called ASDA. It's pronounced ASDA, Association for Size, Diversity, and Health. And a key part of their mission is size acceptance and diversity. In a sense, this is one of those pro-fat fat acceptance movement groups. You could really say the originators of the fat acceptance movement. This is a great resource to go to learn more. It's a group of people that is energetic, that brings a lot of momentum to this issue or question of how do we value size? How do we develop perceptions of appearance? How do we truly celebrate diversity in all of its different beautiful aspects? And for those of you that are providers or aspiring providers, I would direct you to Health at Every Size. I need to be very careful. That's a trademark registered term. I have not asked permission to use the term, so I'm not making any claims about Health at Every Size. I'm simply saying if you're interested in learning about the impact of your roles, your attitudes, your interactions with clients, Health at Every Size should be something you check out, and that's linked to that ASDA page. Okay, so I would encourage you to check that out if you're a provider or aspiring provider and you want to learn about the philosophy of change. Again, I had mentioned this at some different points, but I'm very much open to continued conversation if that's something you'd like via email, and that's something that can be shared if you contact our admissions department. They can share that email, and we can continue some conversations by email. It's something I'm passionate about, and I've found that if there's something you're passionate about, you're willing to give the time, you're willing to give that energy to interact with others in our collaboration together. So thank you very much for participating today.
All right. I would like to thank Dr. Peter Jaberg for presenting today, and I'd like to remind everyone that Dr. Jaberg does teach in our PsyD program. I'd also like to encourage everyone to reach out to us about our programs and about scheduling a visit to our campus. You can find the information about the programs online at our website. That's www.forest.edu, and we're happy to answer questions by phone anytime at 1-800-424-7793. You should see that on your screen, and you can also contact us at that number to schedule a visit or for any other questions. And at this time, I'd like to open the floor here to questions regarding Dr. Jaberg's presentation, the programs, admissions, or visiting campus. And remember, everyone, if you have questions, you can use the bar on the left side of your screen to submit those to us, and we can answer them for you right now. Okay, well, again, I'd like to thank everyone for attending. Feel free to contact us at any time, and have a great rest of the day. Bye-bye.